Good afternoon to you from India. My name is Raj Kumar. I'm the Vice Chancellor of OP Jindal Global University. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to the second day of the two-day conference on reimagining and transforming the university, organized by OP Jindal Global University and several of our partners. We have come to a very important dialogue on the second day of the conference entitled Women's Leadership at the University. I have a very distinguished set of individuals who have built institutions and who have transformed institutions in their respective universities and countries. Let me have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Alice PROCHASKA, former Pro-Vice Chancellor and former Principal of Somerville College, University of Oxford. Thank you, Alice, for being here. Professor CHANDRIKA WIJEYARATNE, Vice Chancellor of the University of Colombo in Sri Lanka. And we are expected very shortly, Professor Dr. YONG ZUBAIRI, Associate Vice Chancellor, International University of Malaya, Malaysia. We also have with us two of my colleagues, Professor DIPIKA, JAIN, Vice Dean Research, Jindal Global Law School of OP Jindal Global University, India, and Professor KALYANI UNKULE, Director and Head, Office of Alumni Relations, OP Jindal Global University. As some of you know, a few weeks ago, New York Times had carried an article entitled, "Why Are Women-Led Nations Doing Better with COVID?" And they talked about New Zealand, Taiwan, Finland, and Germany, four of those specific countries which have been able to manage COVID much better than many others. Of course, any such conclusions drawn in that manner has its own limitations, but the point that a particular article says, and part of the larger imagination, that to what extent women are uniquely suited to take up leadership role, and how organizations, institutions, nations can fundamentally be reimagined with women's leadership. With that, we are beginning this panel. Over to Kalyani and Dipika. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raj. I am delighted to be moderating this amazing panel with the amazing Kalyani. Welcome to the special dialogue on women's leadership at the university. Sarah Emmett, a prominent feminist scholar in the UK, in her brilliant book on being included on diversity in academia says, and I quote, "To work in the gap is to work for completion. Diversity and equality aren't typically actions that are being completed. For such actions to be completed, if the university is not behind them, it requires individuals to keep pushing for their completion. No wonder that the university workers are often seen as pushy. Pushing is necessary when institutions are not behind what they send out. If hearts and minds stands for a sense of commitment that is missing, then diversity workers have to become what is missing. They become the hearts and mind. The Global Gender Index, in terms of participation of women in academia across countries, indicate that while in countries like USA and Australia, women participation in academia is about 40 to 45%. In Europe, it's about 30 to 35%. Having said that, only 30% of women amongst these hold leadership positions. In Asian countries like China, India, and Japan, it is less than 25%. Dr. Santos, in a study which I came across recently in 2019 at Cardiff University, studied over 2,000 academics at the 24 top universities across UK. The research found that male academics reached more senior level positions than their female counterparts, even when taking parental responsibilities into account. The World Economic Forum recently put out a global gender gap report in 2020, and it says that no country in the world has achieved gender parity, and academia is no exception. And pandemic, as we all know, has aggravated this situation. In this current context, this context, the current session will reflect on some of these aspects and also address the impact of pandemic the impact of pandemic on gender in academia. Professor PROCHASKA and Professor Wijeyaratne, you've been amazing leaders in university. I've had the personal opportunity to follow your work, your amazing work in the leadership realm. My question to you is as follows. Number one, how do you think having women in leadership positions in academia makes a difference to the university ecosystem and society at large? How do we ensure that representation of women in academia is beyond tokenism? Number two, we know that academia is deeply gendered. What are some of the biggest challenges for workplace gender equality in academia? How can universities respond to these challenges? May I please request you to respond?
well, would you like me to?
Yes, Professor Prochaska, you could go first and then we can have Professor Wijeyaratne respond.
Right. Well, there's a general understanding that women are more interested in the pastoral and care side of universities than their male counterparts. And I'm sure this has not necessarily always been true. But as the numbers of women in high positions grows, it is more acceptable for women leaders to deploy the advantages of the feminine stereotype, and it does have advantages, to the benefit of all students, male and female. Modern universities certainly do pay more attention now than they did even a decade ago to issues of mental health and social provision, and issues to do with sexuality and gender, including sexual harassment, are taken much more seriously than before. The mental health of male and female students benefits as a result. But as far as tokenism is concerned, my feeling is that we probably have progressed beyond that, certainly in American and European universities, and I know that the other speakers will talk about their countries. But that doesn't mean that women's contributions are always treated with equal respect. And it's a common experience for women among my colleagues to find that ideas that they put forward in committee discussions, for example, are only heard and discussed when they are subsequently put forward by a man. It's a matter of amusement, but it also has serious implications. So you ask what are some of the biggest challenges for workplace gender equality? And I would say that the pandemic has exposed a deeply rooted inequality that women as parents usually shoulder far more of the childcare responsibilities than men, and they also take on a higher proportion of other family care, for example, for elderly relatives. According to current research, and there is some very new research on this subject, mothers in the USA spend twice as much time on childcare as fathers during this pandemic. And in Europe, that figure is a little bit less, but still high. There's been a measurable reduction in the proportion of early research submissions made by women compared with men as a result. And among the possible solutions, and you ask for solutions, I just draw attention to assessment schemes, research assessment schemes and rankings. For example, the Research Excellence Framework in the United Kingdom, where I think that we ought to be allocating a weighted rating to research that can be shown to have been affected by caring responsibilities during the pandemic. And universities themselves could and should explicitly take account of these factors in considering appointments and promotions. So I will leave it at that and hand over back to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I think universities need to be very reflective on the care factor that the women are disproportionately engaging with. Professor Wijeyaratne, may I please request you to offer your comments?
Thank you, and I bring warm greetings from the University of Colombo. And thank you very much for engaging our university. And to answer your question as to whether leadership positions for women in the academia makes a difference, it would have been nice if it was, it would have been better, I feel, that if there was a male counterpart who could actually make the comments. But overall, I would say that the women tend to be capable of taking on, beyond the pastoral role, nurturing and being more democratic, as much evidence has shown, to be socially conscious, and to be also making very practical, finding practical solutions while multitasking. So there is both the biological as well as the behavioral capabilities among the women. And from a South Asian perspective, I would like to highlight the fact that our societies are predominantly patriarchal, and therefore there are relatively deficient policies at national or even institutional level to address the gender gaps. And this is why in countries like Sri Lanka, which have had ever since independence over the past 70 years, universal access to health and education without gender bias. And we have now a female preponderance. This is certainly not matched in the academic space in terms of gender neutrality. So the women-friendly space is still evidently lacking. And the number of women, even be it at student times, coming forward to get involved in politics or in leadership roles is few and far between. And therefore, it is not just within our sphere of higher education, but it is a social outlook that needs to change. And if we invest in women who have, there's no difference between men and women when it comes to education, and maybe women tend to be academically conscientious, to quote one of our own women leaders, but she says that we tend to be politically apathetic. So from a numbers point of view, as was mentioned, as opposed to the UK and the Western countries, we out here tend to do not have matching numbers in senior positions. So be it at professorial level, it is not reflected in terms of the student numbers, as much as in headships of departments or even as vice chancellors or deans. So no doubt we need to address this as a gap and be strong in our, maybe through empirical mapping and a very sound policy development to say, let's have gender norms which are acceptable to all parties. Because as was mentioned before, the COVID epidemic clearly showed the capabilities of women. When I talk about my own university, it's not just myself, but the director of staff development, the director of research, the director of international affairs, they were all women. And they came forward along with the welfare branch, which was also woman-led. And we were able to cope with the sudden need for change, the sudden need to evacuate, the sudden need to change to online. And not that we were able, denied any problems in terms of support from our male counterparts, but the women were quite capable of managing despite the pressures of, as was stated, about childcare, home care, and also managing our elderly and sick population within families and within communities. So what I would like to say is, hire the number of women in the academy. We need to have addressed the need for transformation of women leadership through capacity building as well as through policy development. In terms of parliamentary representation and getting involved in politics, women tend to take a back seat. And that is something that our part of the world needs to address. I mean, no doubt there are socio-political and religious reasons, but we need to address this during our academic and undergraduate as well as postgraduate discussions and planning. In terms of your second question about tokenism, I am of the view that Sri Lanka has overcome such a status, but nevertheless, we need to appreciate that we have to move further forward and take it as gender norms being equal opportunities without factoring gender. That would be my main message for the start.
Thank you so much, Professor Vijayarathne. We are now joined by Professor ZUBAIRI. Welcome, Professor ZUBAIRI, to the special dialogue. So we are just on the first two questions, and I'd like to invite your comments on the first two questions on women leadership in academia and gender being and academic spaces being extremely gendered, and your view on those two aspects.
Thank you very much, DIPIKA. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this session. It is really a very good initiative by the university to consider this topic, which is very relevant, especially in the situation that we are facing right now. So I'm going to go straight to the questions that you have posed. So on the first one, the women in the leadership positions is it's something that it should be taken in. But nevertheless, yeah, women in leadership, taking leadership positions in academia is really a great challenge, because by the historical data shows that the problems with regard to institutional structures, system, and perhaps the mindset of people around, the stereotype, the barriers that need to be overcome, really require a transformative change in general. So what we have learned from this global pandemic is that the world finally acknowledged the unique talents, the unique grit that women have in handling this problem. So the lessons learned go beyond the crisis situation, in which I think women have been very well adapting to this change. Women are known as transformational leaders, in which we demonstrate the elements of compassion, care, concern, respect, and equality. So in fact, in general terms, there are compelling evidence on the relationship between diversity of thoughts and innovation that leads to enhanced performance in any enterprise. So in other words, women and men with different backgrounds and experience will lead with different perspective and different background, will be able to come up with a very good strategy that is able to be executed at all levels. So on the second question, my take on this is that, again, I cannot help but relate with the pandemic. I believe the noticeable challenge is the work-life imbalance of women, in which women take a greater share of having to homeschool children as well as childcare. This really affect the mid-career women academics who should be moving into the leadership role. However, they are at a higher risk of losing their opportunities, as they have no other option but in some of them to take unpaid leave or miss out in such promotions. So in times like this, yeah, I believe the support from the university is extremely crucial, which is not just on staff career advancement, but also the social support that helps to overcome the barriers and challenges faced by women. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zubairi. Certainly, inequalities deeply institutional and deeply structural, and there is a need for transformative changes. And I think our next set of questions will be looking specifically at the pandemic, and I'm going to invite Kalyani to please take over for the next set of questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dipika. I think you really set the tone for this discussion when in your initial remarks, you made reference to both hearts and minds. And I think if we were to briefly summarize the whole debate about women's leadership in education, that's the phrase that comes closest to, I would say, just conveying the crux of the debate. Like you said, the next couple of questions before we open it up for audience Q&A are really going to be an invitation to the panelists to share their views on the pandemic and the post-pandemic outlook for the higher education sector, with specific reference to the potential for women as leaders in education. You already in your opening remarks said a little bit about specific policies and strategies that might work and enable us to better tap into the potential of women as leaders in higher education. But my next question is really, first of all, if you could reflect on, does inclusion acquire a new meaning in the post-pandemic world? And in that light, what would be some of the strategies and policies at the institutional level that you would like to see innovatively implemented? We could start, please, with Professor Prochaska.
Well, answering your question, first of all, about how the current, how the pandemic is affecting the position of women currently. I think the picture is mixed, and in some ways, as has been said by the other speakers, it may possibly favor women because they are coming into great prominence in this crisis. Some female scientists and high-ranking officials are taking a leading role, and there was a reference earlier on to the vaccine team at Oxford, which is producing something that looks very, very promising as a global vaccine, and it's led by a woman, Professor Sarah Gilbert. There are plenty of other examples in the United Kingdom and also in the United States, including public health leaders who appear regularly on the broadcast media now to talk about the pandemic and to guide public policy. And in the United States, state governors have been very prominent, women governors of states, in talking sense at a time when sometimes that is in short supply. So in my own university, Oxford, the leadership of a female vice-chancellor, Professor Louise Richardson, has helped women to take on some of the most demanding roles, and both during the pandemic and before. So they were already well positioned. And it's difficult to specify how particular policies can place women in leadership roles because leadership is so individual. But as much as anything, it's a question of institutional cultures. And that's certainly changing in the United States and in European universities. There are now far more female heads of colleges in the Federal University of Oxford, for example, to cite my own institution, far more female heads of colleges than there ever were before. Its number has risen from about 9 to about 20. More female vice-chancellors in the United Kingdom as a whole. And change is coming, but it's maybe coming faster than it was as a result of the pandemic, although it's still painfully slow. And to move to the next question and talk about caregiving and policies, I do think that new patterns of working with more tolerance for working at home will introduce a new flexibility which will benefit both women and men. But the challenges remain formidable. And universities should not allow themselves to assume, for instance, that they can reduce their support for childcare. Quite the opposite. And in the UK, government has been slow historically to support nursery provision for preschool children, compared with Germany, where nursery provision from the age of 2 is free, which it is not in Great Britain. So to conclude, I would say that there's a great need for good childcare policies, and this is where universities themselves can do an enormous amount to support the position of women. Maybe what we need to do is to treat this holistically and looking at the benefit for families as a whole, but also for all individuals, whether they are parents and members of families with young children or not, to establish a higher respect for the demands that are made on people's time in their personal lives, enabling them then to make a proper contribution academically. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Prochaska. Professor Wijeyaratne, if you could address the same question, please.
Yes, basically the COVID-19 pandemic catapulted the entire groups of higher education as well as all sectors of society into action and brought the women academics in the universities to the forefront. They were very quick to respond. They were very quick to learn new skills, particularly online support systems, as well as online teaching, and also to provide the student supports. As you know, we have a public university and many students come from very rural and difficult backgrounds. And some of our women academics came forward on their own to set up a student distress fund. And they were so socially conscious and tied up to the fact that there was a huge economic backdrop as a bad outcome of the sudden closures. They also identified those who were in need of access to internet and the lack of hardware. And our academics, particularly the women, were very conscious of the quadrupled rise in gender-based violence in our societies. I'm sure this was happening all over the world. So basically, women in academia were able to forge ahead to bring about new support systems and also address mental well-being. And they were, as the previous speaker said, addressing in a very holistic fashion, and were very well supported by their male counterparts. Particularly in terms of counseling, we formed student staff groups in small numbers, and through WhatsApp, they were able to support them. And this was essentially a women-led process. Additionally, our scientists were in the forefront, female scientists, on COVID testing, and also to incorporate research activities in terms of particularly the indigenous herbal preparations as to whether they had a role in prevention of corona. We also had various discussions on educational reforms. Working from home was a new norm, and many women were able to, on a remote basis, contribute to actually bringing about effective discussion about changing our educational landscape. And meanwhile, we also addressed sexual harassment and also brought in programs such as mindfulness meditation, which was important to those who had so many anxieties linked to the corona epidemic. So I think the positive side of the entire thread was that women could come to the forefront and work together along with their male counterparts, and this probably would be an active inspiration to our next generation of women academics to take on leadership roles. In answer to your second question about the changes in the work norms and also the fact that their home systems collapsed, and it came about that childcare and also caring for the elderly became the problem of mainly the women workers. So be they academics or farmers or factory workers, they had some form of childcare supports previously, and suddenly they had to adjust to this new norm. So since there was a lockdown, social isolation, the entire burden seemed to fall upon women. And therefore, they needed to be able to cope with the situation. And as institutions, we took a decision that we will be very flexible in their on-site working hours, as well as be flexible about parental leave policies as and when it was required, provided the work could be done from home. So the provision of institutional support for women, educating the students and the lecturers to establish this culture, making this as a good example, to respect gender diversity and help create a society that provides equal social worth for women is, I would say, the required goal of our institutions. The world's response led to many countries, as was stated, women-led countries were those who were quick to respond, and we can learn many lessons from that about women's leadership.
Thank you so much, Professor Wijeyaratne. Professor Zubairi, may we have your thoughts, please?
Thank you very much once again. So on your question here on the current pandemic, I think just like any other institution, it really forced universities globally to change the way we do things within a very short time space. So that what it means, we had online learning, we quickly need to have series of training sessions. We need to decide on the examinations online, and in other words, revamp the whole academic calendar. So for us in doing so, we had a series of engagement meetings with academic staff. And when we have this kind of a discussion, I noted that the women academics are very more forthcoming, in which when we decide on whatever needs to be done, there is no one is left behind. Meaning female students, postgraduate students, students who are also having to take care of their children at home are taken into account. Not to mention as well students who might have problems with internet connectivity and other barriers that students face. So I note that as opposed to the other gender, they are more forthcoming. Whenever the decisions is made, it has the essence of empathy, making sure that nobody is left behind as we work, coming up with the decision. And for University Malaya, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the Academic Affairs is a woman. So she herself, before even deciding on anything, consensual decisions are made with great empathy, taking into account of different groups of students. And I find this is truly amazing. So with regard to the institutional policy, I think this event really provides an example in which women can actually take forth when it comes to crisis. So I think around the globe, women leaders really have rise to the challenge, and this could very well be a huge stepping stone in which we need to embrace a culture of diversity, voices from women who actually do fare better with regard to managing crisis and taking all pockets of shortcomings when we make the decision. On the last point, on the last question, whether there is any change on the women beyond COVID-19, I think what really stood out was the challenge working from home, because as women work from home, they have to be juggling between working in the office, attending meetings, and at the same time providing homeschooling for children, creating a quality time with the children, providing childcare, and also the household chores as well. So looking forward here, what are the possible, what kind of support that we need from the management would be embracing this new norm. What would be the innovative processes that we might want to consider in making sure that everyone are able to provide as much as they can, to contribute as much as they can to boost the productivity and efficiency, and also to create a stronger culture with better work-life balance for the staff. And also, I think, reduce costs that could very well, in which things can be done virtually and also remotely. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, well said. Thank you to the panelists. It's now time to turn to the audience Q&A. And I see that we're already receiving very interesting questions, both from a systemic or a societal standpoint, but mainly looking at institutions and the higher education system itself. A couple of interesting questions in particular. Start with the first one, which is really about, if I were to rephrase this question, what kind of work is really valued in universities? The hierarchy of value that we place on different types of output. And within that, women usually finding themselves devoting more time to pastoral care, to doing the emotional labor, to creating a good work environment, and these kind of aspects in the end not being valued as much when we talk about academic output or when we talk about performance evaluation. So this happens to be one of the questions that has come in from the audience. So if the panelists could please comment on this aspect where women usually disproportionately do handle the caring responsibilities even within universities. And maybe we can go in reverse order starting with Professor Zubairi.
Thank you very much. I think there is a silver lining to this because with our experience here, when we had to go online, we had to have series of trainings, and I noted that women are really forthcoming in which they share their work through webinars. A number of them actually writes on how do they overcome the difficulties on online examinations and a few other things. So I suppose that's where women knows how to take this opportunity to share their good practices, to become in the forefront of how do they handle this kind of challenges. And also in some other areas in which they help in the community. We have a group of women who actually reach out to international students who are all left at the residential college. They are not able to go back. So they really make an effort to be in touch with them online and also to make them feel they are also part of the community. They are away from home, but we do care about them. And all of these are documented through the news, local media as well. So I think what is really missing, perhaps women in general, we are so used as a caregiver that we forget to share the good work that we have with the public. Thank you very much.
Right. Is there anything we can do, Professor Wijeyaratne, to ensure that this kind of work, the kinds of initiative that women have taken, which Professor Zubairi just described, is better valued within institutions? What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, as Zulina said, I mean, women came to the forefront. It's not that men didn't, but women were more participatory and more capable of multitasking, which we really need to pay due respect to. In terms of the need to change your style of teaching, the need to interact with remote through the ICT mechanisms were always taken on with positivity by the women. And in fact, what I was thinking was that we have quality assurance, which are internal and external. And we need to address this as across the board, that these aspects also need to be taken into account when measuring the quality of our institutions and study programs. And also the fact that efficiency probably was in fact increased and improved through the remote control mechanisms of having Zoom meetings and coming to decisions. And also we could, I would see this with a positive note. Not to say that women were playing a nurturing role alone, but they played a dual role. And this should be noted. And it's not that men did not, but women were probably more agile and able to overtly support those students who needed support. I would also like to mention, in as much as the international students who needed support, we also have students with special needs. And that again was addressed with a lot of female academic partnerships during these difficult times.
Thank you. And Professor Prochaska.
Well, I share the experiences that have already been described and about women and their pastoral role, and this seems to be a worldwide phenomenon. I'd add one thing which is coming through from research that's being done on the impact of the pandemic on the role of women. And there are papers published in the scientific journals Nature, Science, the World Bank has also produced a paper. And they draw attention to the fact that in most universities, women disproportionately take on more teaching. And in the pandemic, the universities have had to adapt to completely new teaching methods, produce lots of new teaching material in order to provide online for their students. And who are the people who've had to do that disproportionately? They are the women. And a direct result of that has been that there's been a decline, measurable decline, in the number of women who are, or the proportion of women compared with their male counterparts who are producing first research papers. Now, the indications are very early because we're only in the middle of the pandemic. We've only been at this for a few months, but it does look as though the roles that women undertake in universities, and I include a disproportionate amount of teaching in that, are being giving them a disadvantage, putting yet more burden on them, never mind the burden of caring for family members and so forth.
Final question before we close, and we have a couple of minutes left. There are a few questions in the audience queue, from the audience about networks, right? About networks of sharing and support. And let me rephrase that question a little bit and ask you, what would be the one piece of advice that you would give to your younger self looking at a career in the academic sector, reaching right to the top, keeping in mind that you are going to face competing priorities, you're going to be up against the very real threat of burnout, the very real prospect of burnout, and you are going to be thrown curveballs like the COVID-19 pandemic along the way. What would be the one piece of advice that you would give your younger self for the long run? Professor Prochaska.
Oh, me first. I think I need to advise myself to be much more assertive and not to allow in meetings the men to dominate the discussion, as I too often have done. That's my one piece of advice.
Professor Wijeyaratne?
I would say that there is a solution to every problem. And whether you're man or woman, you can do it.
Well said. And finally, Professor ZUBAIRI.
I think the network of women. I didn't realize that the immense network of women helping each other is until this pandemic. I didn't realize we can be very strong collectively. Yeah.
All right. I think that brings us close to the end of our time. Let me thank the panelists so very much, as well as my fellow moderator, DIPIKA, for an amazing session. Inclusion is a theme that has been running right through the various sessions of this conference. But I think that what's been special about this particular panel is that we have brought the element of the heart, and it has been a heartfelt discussion. And some of the advice you've shared, not only at the institutional level, but at the personal level, will stay with all of us. And with that, let me give it back to Vice-Chancellor Dr. Rajkumar.
Well, thank you very much. What an extraordinary panel. We were not even sure how this dialogue will go when we conceived of it, but we are so delighted that all of you accepted. I would like to personally thank Dr. Alice Prochaska, who has been a great source of inspiration for me personally for a very long time. Thank you so much, Alice, for being here. I would like to Professor Chandrika Wijeyaratne. We look forward to hosting you in India, and we hope that your university and our university can do things together. Thank you for your comments and your participation. And of course, Professor Dr. YONG ZUBAIRI for your comments and your participation. And I particularly want to thank the three of you for your leadership in your respective institutions and your countries. And I think that aspect of leadership is so inspiring, because all the things that you said would resonate with a lot of people who have been watching this program, and also who somehow feel at times diffident that they may not have that voice that will allow them to have that space. And so both the need for the voice and the space becomes critical in institutions as much as in countries. So I'm grateful to the three of you for being part of this dialogue. I'm particularly grateful to my two wonderful colleagues, Deepika and Kalyani, who are themselves truly outstanding leaders at our own university. And thank you so much for moderating this panel. Again, I want to say that we are on schedule and the special dialogue has just ended. Thank you very much.